been some time since we last checked out Crusher Joe, so why not check out the other two OVAs that spawned years after the movie came out. The first episode is called The Ice Prison. The episode opens up with these guys protesting this dictator Gestal. The police show up and start firing on the protesters. Watching this in 2021 really puts a damper on things in real life. Anyway, we cut to the prison on this asteroid covered in ice. These prisoners were a part of this group protesting Gestal and are now part of the prison. We see the prisoners being abused and mistreated as they're forced to dig through this ice when this robot shoots one of the prisoners for slacking off. We then see a satellite in orbit that shoots a beam at the prison, and it causes it to be caved in and traps the prisoners inside. It also causes the prison to be put on a collision course to planet Curious. We then cut to this tropical planet where Joe and his crew are enjoying their time off, vacationing on the beach. After a few hijinks on the beach, they get a call from Barney from Aramis. Barney asks them to go on a new mission to rescue the prisoners from the ice prison and stop it from hitting planet Curious. Joe and company object to it since they've been working non-stop on missions and deserve a break. However, Barney tells them that they are the closest crushers there and they have to do it, so Joe accepts the mission. When they go meet Chief Secretary Helm, who works under Gestal, he debriefs them on their mission. They ask Helm why they'd want to rescue the prisoners anyway, since they've been protesting them, and it'd be in their best interests not to. Helm says despite their actions, they're not evil, and they still want to save them. So Joe and the crew head out to save the prisoners with only 40 hours before the prison crashes into the planet. Of course, Helm has ulterior motives, as the Crushers are busy trying to get the prisoners out. Joe is struck by a bunch of explosions. He tries telling Helm something is up, and then Helm reveals he's double-crossed Joe. Gestal and Helm wanted to make it look like they tried to rescue the prisoners, but failed instead. That way they get the goodwill of the people on their side. Joe, however, does not take this very well and tells Helm he better hope he doesn't live. Geez, you think these people would stop trying to betray Joe? It never ends well for them. Meanwhile, the rest of his crew are forced to retreat due to the explosions back inside the main ship. Helm ends up taking the rest of the crew prisoners. Joe is forced to go inside the prison where he meets up with the prisoners. The prisoners at first think he can save them with his ship, but it can only fit 4 people inside, so unless a bigger ship comes by, they're all screwed. Luckily, Joe comes up with an idea. If they can melt through the ice, a distress beacon can reach them and save the prisoners. Meanwhile, the rest of the Crushers end up breaking out of the ship, and they return to the Minerva. Joe and the prisoners are eventually able to melt through the ice and get the distress beacon working. The crew discover the distress beacon Joe and the prisoners have put out. However, as Joe waits there, Hume's men show up and start firing at Joe. Luckily, he has a heat-seeking launcher that can take out most of them. Ricky, Alphen, and Talos finally show up and take out the last of Hume's men, and pick up the prisoners. Hume's ship shows up to fight Joe. However, the United Space Force comes to Joe's rescue. Hugh tries to shoot at the USF ship, but it only scratches them. They retaliate by blowing the fuck out of them. The OVA ends with the prisoners going back to Curious to keep fighting Gestal till he's finally defeated, with Joe wishing them luck. The second OVA, The Ultimate Weapon, Ash, we see this spaceship being under attack by renegade soldiers. Major Tanya is holding a briefcase handcuffed to her arm while fighting this renegade Jimenez. We then cut to President of Bandor, who shoots himself with some kind of drug and it knocks himself out. His aides find out he's sick and they decide to call a medical ship to come get him. When the medical team arrives to come get the president, his aides try to go with him, but his main aide tells them they can't because the president's disease is infectious and they could get it. The medical ship leaves with the president. The team shoots him with something and he comes to. He asks for some water. The medic responds that he doesn't have any, but he has some estrogen that he can drink. It's revealed that the medical team is none other than Crusher Joe. This was a secret mission devised by the president by the utmost importance. No one else can know about it. A space wreck happened. Space insurrectionists hijacked a USF spaceship and forced them to land on planet Dobita. They need to rescue Major Tanya and destroy the Ash, a deadly weapon that has the power to wipe out a whole planet. For 5 years, the nations of Bandor and Carminus have waged war, but now both nations have negotiated peace talks and are putting an end to the war. However, some high-ranking officer has betrayed Bandor and wants the war to continue by using the Ash. Joe and his crew accept the mission, and they hand the president over to the hospital. We cut to Joe and the crew making their way to Dobita when they are attacked by Colonel Mordor. They try to tell him that they have orders from the president, but he isn't listening. So Joe fires back and a small scuffle ensues. Both of the ships suffer damage and are forced to make emergency landings on Dobita. We find out that Dobita is infected with cloakers, these ball robots that are very deadly. Crusher Joe and his team set out to search for Major Tanya while avoiding these cloakers. Meanwhile, Colonel Mordor is also on his mission to rescue Tanya as well. Joe makes his way to the ship with the rest of the crew following, but the cloakers are too much. Alphen gets an idea to lure the cloakers away while Ricky and Talos can go and help Joe. Eventually Joe finds Tanya and blows the fuck out of one of her captors. Joe tells her who he is, and she asks for a glass of water. Joe says he doesn't have any, but he has some messaging she can drink. This is actually the president's secret password, so Tanya can trust him. So she goes along with Joe. Ricky and Talos run into Joe, but they are followed by a bunch of cloakers. They take out most of them, but Jimenez ends up kidnapping Tanya as they are fighting the cloakers and gets away. Jimenez thinks he has the upper hand and can strike a deal with the ESF. However, when Jimenez hands over Tanya, Colonel Mordor ends up shooting him and asks Tanya to give him the ash. Tanya says she will, but she asks for a glass of water. Mordor obliges, and that immediately sets off to her that something is wrong. He got the president's password wrong. She finds out that he's the traitor, and that he wants the ash to end the war by destroying Carminos, rather than peacefully like the president wants to. Tanya threatens to blow the whole planet up unless Mordor tells her who told him to betray them. Mordor says it was Colonel Caraway, but as this is going on, Joe finds them, and in the confusion, one of Mordor's men knocks the ash out of Tanya's hand, and it turns out Jimenez is still alive, but barely. He activates the ash before falling on the ground and dying. With only 20 minutes before the ash detonates, Joe, his crew, and Tanya hightail it out of there, while avoiding Mordor and his men. They call Alphen to meet them back at the Minerva. Mordor tries to blow up their ship before they can leave, but the cloakers end up breaking into his ship and kill him. Joe and the crew barely make it out of there with the ash enveloping the planet and destroying everything. Joe, Tanya, and the others survive, and hopefully peace between the two nations will finally be reached. So both OVAs were pretty dang great. Although both OVAs are about rescue missions, they handled the rescues in different ways. The ice prison is more focused on space combat. It feels urgent enough, but the danger is lower because Joe and his crew are badasses. The bad guy Hyum is pretty good. He isn't too threatening. He's kinda cocky, thinking he can pull a fast one on Joe, though he is just a subordinate to Gestall, the unfought bad guy who was orchestrating everything. I think it's cool to have a bad guy who the heroes don't fight. They only stop his crony at the end of the OVA. Their job getting the prisoners out is done. Now it's up to the prisoners and protesters to hopefully stop them in the future. Meanwhile, the second OVA, the Ultimate Weapon Ash, is more focused on ground combat. The heroes and the villains are facing a terrifying enemy this time. The cloakers are a very deadly robot that can kill you in an instant. These cloakers are so deadly that one guy gets his head blown off. The fact that there is a seemingly endless amount of them puts you on your toes. You desperately hope Alphen or Ricky doesn't end up getting killed by one of these things. The villain of the OVA, Colonel Mordor, is also pretty great. He is a huge piece of shit that wants to genocide a whole planet. Like the first OVA, he is also a traitor, but not directly to Joe like Hume was. We already know he's a piece of shit because of how he treats Joe. No, he's a traitor to the ESA. He's also subordinate to Admiral Caraway, who we never see, and is only briefly mentioned. Almost feels pointless to add since it doesn't really do much for the story. Like they could have just had Mordor as the traitor and that would have been fine. We didn't need to add this character who does nothing for the story. Next I'll touch on Tanya. She's a no-nonsense soldier doing her best to protect the Ash. She's very strong, she has a lot of balls to activate the Ash and kill everyone on the planet if she doesn't find out who the traitor is. One thing I like that involved her is when Crusher Joe's team is rescuing her, and she won't shut the fuck up about being rescued, so Joe just decks her in the head and knocks her out. It was so fucking funny. I won't really talk about the Crusher Joe team since I already did that in the movie review, but they're all pretty great here too. I will however talk about one member I didn't talk about last time, Dongo. Dongo is a part of the Crusher Joe's team. He's a smart, snarky robot. He usually pilots the Minerva when the crew are gone. He was actually in the Crusher Joe movie, but he didn't do much other than sit around in the background. I figured I'd mention him here since he accompanies Joe on the first OVA on the rescue mission, and he helps the team a little bit in the second one. He's okay, I guess. He thankfully didn't annoy me, so that's good. Oh, and when I was looking up Dongo, apparently he likes to look at porno mags, according to Wikipedia. What a weird character. Anyway, I think both OVAs are great episodes to watch. They both share a lot of similar themes, but they handle them differently. The only gripe I have is the first OVA has these small act breaks, and when they happen, a small voice speaks out, "Crush!" And it does this several times throughout the OVA, and it's only the first OVA that does it. It never happens in the second one for some reason, so it just feels out of place. But other than that small nitpick, both OVAs are great. It's a real shame that this is really it for Crusher Joe in terms of animation. They didn't bother making any more episodes or movies about Crusher Joe. Sadly, the only thing Crusher Joe has gotten recently is a manga called Crusher Joe Rebirth, a sort of reimagining of Crusher Joe. I have no idea if it's good or not, and I couldn't find any English scans online, so we're fucked. But hey, maybe one day people will realize that Crusher Joe is amazing, and they'll make a new anime series. Anyway, check out these OVAs. There's some fun space adventures that we sadly don't get anymore. See you later, Crusher Joe.